Dave's podcast, Episode 7, Unemployment, Stable Cottage, Hector, Doug, and a certain balcony in Majorca. So when I started this podcast about the various jobs I'd done, I'd actually forgotten about this period when I was unemployed. It was a strange time. In some ways, it was the happiest time of my life. I was with Debbie. We were having lots of sex. Sorry, that's probably too much information. But it was also a very hard time after the first few months, when the reality of being unemployed began to hit. We settled into life at Stable Cottage. Debbie worked in the large old people's home across the yard. Oh, I could talk about Debbie's work. That would qualify. She worked shift hours, so would often go off to work at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, sleep in and not return till 2 o'clock the next day. Debbie loved her work. The residents were there because they could no longer look after themselves at home, so they were quite old and frail. Mortimer House was a big old rambling manor house, a bit like a small Downton Abbey. We had the main house where all the residents lived, and lots of small outbuildings. These would have been originally used for storing food, produce, bread, and that kind of thing. One of these was used as a temporary morgue. Sadly, if a resident died over the weekend, the doctor wouldn't come to certify them until a Monday. One weekend, Debbie had 3 residents die. She had to get them downstairs, out into this room, lay them out, and sometimes put pennies on their eyes. It really was quite hard work. Stable Cottage, as its name suggests, was a small cottage with a stable at one end. On the first floor, it had a large entrance hall. Off of this was 1 bedroom, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a lounge, and a door leading through to these 2 stables. Upstairs was just 1 large bedroom. Originally, the family would have lived in this 1 room upstairs, while all various livestock, including the horses, would have lived downstairs. It had a number of outbuildings, including a granary on stone mushrooms and a large triple garage, which years ago would have housed a couple of fine horse-drawn coaches. The oil-fired heating never worked well, but luckily we were about to have a record-breaking summer. I figured I would apply for jobs and get the first one after the interview, as I had always done in my previous jobs. The first job I went for was for the electricity board to sell TVs. I remember having the interview and the man saying, "I'm sorry, but you haven't been successful at this time." But I didn't really hear him. "Oh, so when do I start then?" "No, sorry, you were unsuccessful." I was stunned. But this soon became the norm. Then I went to sign on. But because I had voluntarily left my last employment, I couldn't get dole for 6 weeks. Because of Debbie's shift work, I had long periods when I was on my own. So we decided we would get a dog. We went to Bracknell Animal Rescue and we chose Hector. He was a beautiful dog, light brown with a white front. He was about 3 years old, but they didn't know any of the history of his previous owners. When we got home, we took him to a large field opposite. When we let him off, he went absolutely crazy, running around like a mad thing. Debbie was wearing slip-on shoes. Suddenly Hector collided with the back of her legs. Her legs went from underneath her, and her shoes went 20 feet straight up in the air. I can see it clearly now. If someone came to the door, or we left the door open, Hector was away. He would just run and run. It was no good chasing him. He thought this was all part of the game, and he ran even faster. It wasn't a problem at Stable Cottage because we were out in the countryside and it was a quiet country lane. He would disappear across a field, through a hedge and away. We would return home, Eventually, he would come back a few hours later covered in mud and other unmentionable stuff, quite happy and without a care in the world. But Hector was great company. Now I had all this spare time, I started getting into fishing again. Behind us was St Benedict's, a large reform school, which Debbie's mum worked at. This gave her free access to the carp lake in the grounds. I would go there all day with Hector at my feet. 1 tin of sweet corn was all I needed, and as I say, it was a beautiful summertime. This really helped to keep me sane. I better talk about meeting Debbie's mum and dad. It must have been a few weeks after we met. I was invited to Sunday dinner. I came in the house. They had an open-plan kitchen which ran into carpeted dining area. This description is important to this story. Gay, Debbie's mum, had laid out a Sunday dinner. I had never seen so many vegetables. Peas, sweet corn, roast potatoes, mashed potatoes, swede, parsnips, on and on it went. I was introduced and they asked me what I did, and I ran through my various employment history. By then, the dinner was stone cold. No, not really, I'm joking. I started dinner. I picked up my knife and I don't know what happened, but I dropped it. It bounced perfectly on the carpet and propelled itself across the kitchen floor, hitting the back door. I raced after it, scrambling on all floors, but they didn't bat an eyelid. I ended up having a great relationship with my in-laws. They became two of the most highly influential people in my life. In the next few months, Doug, Debbie's dad, with one act of kindness would help me. But more of that later. Or shall we cover it now? Let's talk about it now. The months went by, and don't forget, it had been a big move for me. I had left Cookham, where I was born, all my friends and family. Don't get me wrong, I knew I'd done the right thing. I knew Debbie was the one after a few weeks. Also, I didn't know, but Gay was upset we were living together. We thought they would be fine about it. Linda, Debbie's sister, had left home when very young, and Debbie's brother as well. But she saw Debbie as her last hope of doing things right. Don't forget, it was 1983, and things were a bit different. I don't suppose it helped with me being unemployed, and to be fair, they didn't really know me. So one day, I was outside the post office, reading the notice board. I guess I was looking for odd jobs in Mortimer. Doug came up behind me and said hello, and asked me what I was up to. He then invited me round for coffee. I didn't want to be no trouble, but he insisted. So I went round, and I ended up staying all day, and they fed me several times. Doug showed me his stamp collection. He was very proud of it. It had every First Day cover from all the Commonwealth countries covering Princess Diana's wedding. Doug was disabled and not able to work. He had back issues and asthma. Gay did about 3 jobs to cover the rent. After that day, I could call round any time, if I was a bit lonely or just wanted company. I guess I was depressed before this really became trendy. I don't understand this, but here's an example. One day, Debbie was at work and not due back till the following day. I made a beautiful spaghetti bolognese from scratch. I put it on the plate, and then I just threw the plate against the wall, smashing the plate. Then I calmly spent an hour clearing it up. Sorry, this isn't very entertaining, but I actually feel better. It's good therapy. So the initial 6 weeks went by, and by now I found out that I still wasn't going to get any dole money. There was some kind of investigation into my national insurance payments. There seemed to be a discrepancy while I was at WG Church. So my mum and dad lent me some money to tide me over. We still had this old Fiat car that we were keeping going so that I could get for job interviews. but it had developed a leak in its petrol tank. I removed the tank one day, poured all the petrol into a washing up bowl, and sealed it with fiberglass, which was probably very dangerous and possibly illegal. As the months went by, I'd been for several job interviews with no luck. So it was in August that I applied for a job at AWE, the Atomic Weapons Establishment, Aldermaston, which was about 3 miles from us. You have to remember, it was different times. The Berlin Wall was still up, Maggie had just won a war and so another election, and America was about to put cruise missiles on Newbury Common. As I say, we lived about 3 miles from Aldermaston, and even less from ROF Burfield, and only 10 miles from Newbury. If the bomb dropped, we had no chance. Even the public information leaflets sent out at the time, explaining how you could build a shelter under your stairs, collect some cans of beans and a bucket, it really would have been little use for us. After a few weeks, I got an interview. I went to the main gate and was escorted by an armed policeman to the main office block. It was a massive site with around 5,000 employees, a small town which took 25 minutes to drive round. After the interview, I was told I would hear in the next few weeks, but if successful, I would be subjected to an extensive security checks by MI5. So I waited to hear. But first, Deb and I were off to Majorca on holiday, the first week of September. Remember, this was the one we'd booked after we'd only just met. It was my first trip abroad. Well, I tell a lie, I had done a day trip to Boulogne at school, most notable for Julia Chapman hiding a flick knife down her bra that I had bought. We had a great time joining John and Sandra for the last 10 days of the holiday at the Hotel Lagamonte in Alcudia, Majorca. I remember we had a massive row on the first night. We had gone to a nearby bar with a swimming pool. Deb got really drunk on sangria, and people started throwing peseta coins into the pool, and Deb was diving in to collect them. When we got back to the hotel, Deb started shouting. She had lost her contraceptive pills. I was very drunk too, and not much help, so she set off back to the bar. By now it was the early hours of the morning. The bar was shut up. She returned to the hotel and immediately found said pills in her purse, which she had already searched several times. We woke up the next morning blurry-eyed, but put it all behind us, and we had an amazing holiday. On the last night, I was standing on the balcony. There was a beautiful sunset. I called to Debbie, "Come out on the balcony. Come and see this wonderful sunset." "Oh no," she said, "you're not going to propose." "Well, what would you say?" Bear in mind, I was unemployed. I had no money, no property, apart from an old Fiat with a hole in its petrol tank, some fishing gear, a small record collection, and a crazy dog. A subplot to this proposal story is 20 years later, we bought a timeshare scheme where you could stay at various 5-star resorts within Europe. We came back to Majorca on a newly built complex. Millie and Amy were around 16 at this time. From our back window of the apartment we were allocated, you could see the actual balcony of the Lagamonte Hotel. Oh yes, sorry, spoiler alert, she had said yes. So we arrived back at Stable Cottage, all engaged, and there, on the doormat, was a very important brown envelope, marked MOD. I had got the job. Also included was a large form to fill in, which ran to several pages. This was part of my security check. It covered my schools, family, all the addresses I had lived at, and my employment history. this was going to take some time. I also had to put down 2 or 3 referees. I put down Uncle Bert. He wasn't a real uncle, but we always called him that. I had known him all my life, and he lived on Westwood Green. He was a great friend of my dad and used to come on holidays with us. We would collect and cook mussels off the beach. He was a school headmaster, full of knowledge. He loved wildlife. He had a pet owl that came to his back door to be fed every night. And later he had a snake pit in his garden. Sadly, he lost his wife and his daughter to cancer, but he remained a positive and caring person. I remember he phoned me up afterwards. The MI5 man had came and interviewed me, and he told me all the things he had told him, and he'd made up jokes, which was his way. Sadly, he's filling his pipe while having a pint with my old man in that great pub in the sky now. So it then became time for our interrogation. He wanted us both there, so I arranged an afternoon when Debbie was off. The man arrived. Now, my memory may be playing tricks with me here, but I remember him in a black dinner jacket. He asked for a martini, shaken, not stirred, but I said it was a bit early and offered him a cup of tea. He started asking us fairly innocuous questions. He would hit you with random questions. For instance, how did you first meet Debbie? What does Debbie do for a job? And then he would suddenly blurt out, "So this is a sexual relationship?" I was thrown. This may have been straight out of the MI5 handbook. Or maybe he was just a strange man. But after an hour, he put his pen away, if indeed it merely was a pen, back in his briefcase, and he left in a hail of gravel and dust as the wheels of his Aston Martin spun on the drive. It was September 1983. Me and Debbie had been going out for 9 months, and in 9 months' time, we were going to get married. Things were beginning to work out. I'm sorry this episode of my podcast hasn't been the most cheerful or indeed funny. But hey, the next episode, we're making a nuclear bomb. This was a Just the Ticket production.